Okay, good afternoon, all. It's really a great occasion for all of us to assemble here at this platform for the 6th meeting of Indian Council of Philosophical Research, that is the study circle, which we are holding at Sri Mata Vaishno Devi University. And we are grateful to Professor Bijoy Boruah, who consented to be the speaker for today's session. Professor Bijoy Boruah is a visiting professor of philosophy in the Indian Institute of Technology, Jammu. Before joining this institution, he taught at IIT Kanpur for more than 20 years. He also taught more than 9 years in IIT Delhi. And after his retirement from IIT Delhi, he moved to IIT Ropar, and he guided the students there for 2 years. And we are glad to have him here in the IIT Jammu as Professor of Philosophy. Sir, you are most welcome, and we are thankful for your kind gesture to accepting our invitation. I extend my heartiest welcome to the head of the School of Philosophy and Culture. A special welcome to Justice Hasnain, who is the chairman of Delhi Electricity Regulatory Commission. Sir, you are most welcome in this meeting. We have wonderful professors who joined this session. Professor Kiran Bakshi, who was a principal in the colleges, different government colleges of Jammu region. Madam, you are most welcome. We have professors from every part of our country who have joined this session. I extend heartiest welcome to all the professors and our dear participants, faculty members from different institutions. So this is a good occasion for all of us to interact with a brilliant professor of philosophy from India. And personally, I have great benefit from Professor Boruah, who was my thesis supervisor also in IIT Kanpur. So I record this with a lot thanks to him. Today, he is going to speak on the theme which he has chosen. The theme is, who is looking at me? The mystery of the first-person singular pronoun. So we are going to have his invocation for, let us say, some 40 or 45 minutes or maybe 50 minutes. And after that, we will have question-answer session. So to start the proceeding, I request Mr. Sumanta S. Sharma, who is the head of the School of Philosophy and Culture, to say a few words in regard to Professor Bijoy Boruah and all our participants. Sumanta, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Tewari. In fact, everything what I needed to say is something which you have already said, and also introduced the speaker in an amazing way. And this is what we all understand. In fact, I must praise all the people present here, that the School of Philosophy and Culture at Sri Mata Vaishno Devi University hosted at least 4 faculty members who were students of Professor Boruah, because we all were students of Professor Boruah at IIT Kanpur. So, and I can see that Dr. Harinarayanan V has also joined us, who is currently in IIT Jodhpur. Similarly, I can also see one of our old friends, Dr. Hasibuddin, who has also joined today in this meet. I can also see a few more very, very known faces. Dr. Kiran Bakshi for sure. Then I can also see Professor J.S. Dubey from Bhopal, who has joined us. I can also see Dr. Rita Bhattacharya, who has joined us. So there are so many old friends of ours, as well as faculty and teachers of ours who have joined today. And it is indeed a pleasure. And in fact, I must also tell you one thing more, that recently we have inducted a couple of faculty members to the School of Philosophy and Culture. One is Dr. Satish Tewari, who has joined us today, as well as Dr. Iti Dayal, who is also joining us today. And we hope to, in fact, even having a more vibrant school in the Srimata Vaishno Devi premise. But first and foremost, I would like to thank the Indian Council of Philosophical Research, who has given us the opportunity to host the study circle meet at Srimata Vaishno Devi University, and this is the 6th ICPR Study Circle Meeting at SMVDU. We have held 5 successfully, and it was indeed a pleasure to listen to all these speakers, and I hope that today's session will be even better. So with this hope and with this understanding, I welcome all the participants, all the people who are present today in this meet, right from the faculty members, staff members and students of our university, to all the people and friends who have joined us in our pursuit of some kind of meaning which we will like to learn on these platforms. So with this, I welcome again Professor Bijoy Boruah, who is not only a teacher as well as a philosopher for us, but is also a father figure for us, and we are a family in that respect. So I welcome you, sir, again, and I hand over the charge again to Dr. Tewari so that he can initiate the discussion as well as the speech of Dr. Bijoy Boruah. Tewari ji.
Yeah, thank you, Sumanta sir. It's our privilege to have Professor Piyush Kant Dikshit, also from Lal Bahadur Shastri University, Sanskrit University, Delhi. Sir, you are most welcome. And with this welcome note, I extend heartiest welcome to all the participants who joined. And just for the purpose of record, I have turned on the recording. And those who will have questions in between, you have 2 channels to ask your questions. One, you can use the chat box and type your questions, and the other would be asking the questions directly after the presentation. So please utilize these 2 channels profusely as per your convenience. So with this, I request Professor Boruah to share his thoughts with us. Professor Boruah, sir, over to you.
Thank you, Sumanta, Anil, and SMVDU in general. My relation with SMVDU is fairly old by now, and so is my attachment, fairly strong. I didn't expect so many people from so many angles. I was expecting maybe 10 people, so I am more apprehensive about what I have to say. So I begin here. The title that I sent was, "Who is looking at me? The mystery of the first-person singular pronoun." And I added something to it, and the metaphysical suicide of the I. I didn't want to mention this suicidal statement earlier, but now I have to, because that figures in the overall content of this little presentation. I say little because it's only 3 or 4 pages, and that too framed in different alphabets, that is to say, different passages, alphabetically arranged, A, B, C, D, like that, small passages. So probably I shall have finished everything by 25 minutes, or at the most half an hour. And we shall have, hopefully, a lot more time for discussion, because what matters is discussion. I might be going wrong here and there, but if I go wrong in an interesting way, that is good. So let's begin. Who is looking at me? This is a question mark, and there is an answer to it, of course. One is going to get that answer pretty soon. And looking is only... Hello? Can you hear me? There was some intervention.
Yeah, yes, sir. It's clear.
Okay.
It's clear.
All right. So looking here is only a visual metaphor. So it's not looking at me literally. And then when I wrote Mist-ery, M-I-S-T-E-R-Y, that was deliberate because I didn't want to say the mystery of the first person pronoun. I didn't want to present it as a talk about the mysterious nature of the first person singular pronoun. What I mean by mystery is that there is a bit of mist that surrounds our idea of the first person pronoun, our idea of the self. And that mist needs to be, as it were, dispelled so that you have a clear vision. I would like to think that there is no mystery about the self. I mean, at least within the scope in which I am trying to present this particular idea. So it is only a question of clearing the mist. And when I talk about the metaphysical suicide of the I, that again is, of course, I shouldn't say it's a metaphor, because if I had simply said suicide of the I, that would have been a metaphorical use of suicide. However, if I have qualified the suicide as a metaphysical suicide, then there is no need to resort to any metaphorical meaning, because the qualification metaphysical would make it self-explanatory. That means it's not suicide literally taken. It is, if it is a suicide, it is suicide in some metaphysical sense. All right. With that preamble, I start the first statement under alphabet A, which is my self-introduction. I'm Bijoy Boruah, in short, BB. And obviously, the first-person singular pronoun figures right at the beginning there. Inevitably, it would figure for anyone when it is a question of introducing oneself. B, I identify, recognize myself. Here I hyphenate, put a hyphen, myself. When I identify or recognize Bijoy Boruah. Okay. If I identify or if I recognize Bijoy Boruah, whom do I identify or recognize? Of course, myself. Now, in red, two sentences appear, which I added later on. I identify or recognize Bijoy Boruah as myself from the first person perspective. Everyone does that, of course. I have a first person identity, both ontologically and phenomenologically. What do I mean when I say I have a first person identity ontologically. I mean that I exist in the me mode of being. There is a me mode of being or existence. And it is in that mode I exist. That is what is meant by my first-person identity in the ontological sense. And I also have a sense of being me. In fact, one could say I experience being me. This is the phenomenological sense of, this is what is meant by my having a first-person identity in the phenomenological sense. Next, C, I say, I'm aware of Bijoy Boruah as myself, as me. That's a first-person fact about my mode of being. I'm aware of this person named BB as myself. Nobody else is aware of this person named BB as myself. Only I. That's why it is me. In other words, I am aware of being me. Nobody else is aware of being me. I mean, me, this me that I am. And this is what we mean by self-awareness. I think that much is pretty clear, spelling out the fundamental meaning of self-awareness. I am aware of me or being me. Following that, D, self-awareness is awareness or sense of being me. Again, just a simple spelling out of the meaning of self-awareness. However, the emphasis is, I'm repeating, is this category or notion of being me. There's it's an ontological statement. So there is a being which is being me. And there is an awareness of this being. And now, again, another statement in red, which I call D plus, following claim D, proposition D. D plus is, it's more of an interrogation. And in fact, that is a central issue of this little talk that I'm engaged in at the moment. Do I also have an awareness of being I? I already said there is awareness or sense of being me. That's how I spelt out the meaning of self-awareness. However, why can't I also say, or at least raise the question, that parallel to the awareness of being me, do I also have an awareness of being I? Because so far, self-awareness has been defined in terms of awareness of being me. But what about the I? After all, the I is so central to the very meaning of being a self. So why shouldn't self-awareness be understood as awareness of being I? Is there a distinctly I mode of existence, independently of the me mode of existence? I think such an interrogation, posing a problem in this way would be quite provocative, because it would seem to have generated two selves in one self, as it were. There is only one person, Bijoy Boruah, but it would seem, on the basis of what I have said with this red ink, it would seem that this one person consists of two independent selves or distinct selves. One is self in the sense of being me, and the other is self in the sense of being I. And that kind of dualism, that kind of dichotomy, that kind of splitting of the person into two selves might provoke some, if not protest, some self-critical thought. Could this analysis really be right? Because the oneness of the self seems to be a persistent idea about one's conception of being a self. After all, the very notion of self connotes singularity. The self is singular, and in grammar also, it's the first-person singular pronoun. So given the singularity constraint, one would seem, it might seem that this sort of a division between being I and being me, this sort of a splitting of the person into two selves is problematic. Anyway, let's go ahead and find out whether that really is problematic or that's the right way to go about it. Proposition E, awareness of the me self, and I'm back to self-awareness in the sense of awareness of being me. It's a further bit of spelling out of this proposition E. Awareness implies a subject of awareness. And whatever the subject is aware of, is an object. This is the simple subject-object structure of thought or structure of awareness. Any moment you talk about awareness or thought, you will put the subject on one side of the awareness relation or awareness spectrum, if you like, and the object on the other side of that spectrum. So it's a structural feature that there be a subject of awareness and an object of awareness. In proposition E, the subject of awareness is I. That's why we call it the subject I. Whereas the object of awareness is me. So if you go by this subject-object structural duality of awareness, if you go merely by this structural feature, then it becomes obvious that self-awareness, the very phenomenon self-awareness, neatly reveals these two, if you like, ontological or quasi-ontological features. Namely, there is a me and there is an I. The I is the subject which or who is aware of the me, which is the object of I's awareness. If you go by this kind of an analysis, you seem to be constrained to admit the duality of being I and being me. If you don't concede this duality, the structure, whatever you say would be in conflict with this structural analysis. Okay, so one could make a case for this duality through this sort of a structural analysis. Now let's proceed. F, being I is thus being the self as subject or subject self, whereas being me is the self as object or object self. This notion of self as subject and self as object is quite prominently discussed in Wittgenstein, I think, Blue and Brown book. I needn't go into that. It will take some time, but I'm using that sort of a distinction, Wittgensteinian distinction, for my own purpose. Wittgenstein, of course, draws that distinction and explains it in slightly different way, but whatever he says there is, I hope, compatible with what I'm trying to say. And what I'm trying to say is obvious from the earlier analysis, preceding analysis. Proposition H, the subject self, which is I, is aware of the object self, which is me. The subject-object structure of awareness can be represented as an arrow of awareness. Everyone has the image of an arrow. The arrow points in a certain direction where the target is held, and when the arrow moves, it moves in that direction. So awareness can be depicted graphically as an arrow, and on the left-hand side of the arrow, on the blunt side of the arrow, there is the subject, and the pointed side of the arrow, there is the object. And why do I use this graphic representation of awareness? That is because the arrow of awareness represents a directionality. It is the subject to object direction of fit. That means I to me direction of fit. I am aware of me, but it's not the other way around. There is no inversion of this arrow of awareness. Me is never aware of the I. And this may again provoke some critical thinking. And of course, the whole idea is to provoke you into this. Let's go to the next proposition, K. The me self cannot be aware of the I self. Why? Without ceasing to be me. Because whoever undertakes the act of awareness is ipso facto the I, or subject self. Thus, the directionality of the I to me relation of awareness is asymmetrical. It's asymmetrical directionality. It is not bidirectional. It's not a symmetrical relation. Next, proposition L. By the very structure of consciousness, the I is designed ever to remain a subject of consciousness. It is as if, consciousness has I shouldn't say as if, consciousness does have a structure, and given that structure of consciousness, the I is designed to have the position of the subject. It just cannot change its position from the subject position to any other position. So it is the subject by the very design of the structure of consciousness. By contrast, the me is destined to remain an object of I consciousness. I mean, given the very structure of consciousness, the me is destined to remain an object of I awareness or I consciousness. I mean, this reminds me of Jean-Paul Sartre when he was defining existentialism. He said, man is condemned to be free. Freedom is part of the very structure of human consciousness. So analogously, I feel like saying the me is condemned to remain an object of I consciousness. Well, condemnation here, of course, is a metaphor, nothing pejorative about it. But next, proposition M. This me is how Bijoy Boruah's inner personal identity or self-image appears to Bijoy Boruah's I consciousness. In other words, now I'm trying to say something more about what the hell is this me? What really is the nature of me, the phenomenology and the ontology of me? Well, me is, in fact, self-image, some kind of inner personal identity of the person whom I call Bijoy Boruah, okay, whose name I mention when I introduce myself. So this self-image, inner personal identity, is a self-image. It appears as a particular self-image, but it appears to who? I mean, this very appearance of the self-image is the me. And if the me is this self-image, it's an appearance, to whom does it appear in this form of a self-image, an inner personal identity? It appears to none other than the I consciousness of the person that Bijoy Boruah is. That means it appears to Bijoy Boruah's I consciousness, to nobody else. And to nobody else's I consciousness, only to Bijoy Boruah's I consciousness. The me is thus an appearance, and whoever has awareness of this appearance cannot, on pain of circularity, be me. That means I can't say if me is an appearance, I can't say it's an appearance, the me is an appearance that me is aware of. That would be quite circular. And therefore, the me is an appearance, and only I am aware of this me. It must be other than me. Indeed, it is I who am aware of me. So again, the duality, I-me duality, becomes more prominent. The argument for that duality becomes more forceful, stronger. In other words, proposition 9, in other words, being me is a reality, both phenomenologically and ontologically, only because the person, Bijoy Boruah, comes under the inner purview of Bijoy Boruah's I consciousness. And I consciousness, what I call I consciousness, is something like an inner purview or inner view, if you like. And this person named Bijoy Boruah, this person comes under that inner purview of I consciousness. The moment it comes under the inner purview of I consciousness, it becomes me. That means the very being of me, the very existence called being me, is manifest only to I consciousness, only when the person Bijoy Boruah comes under the inner purview of I consciousness. And the next statement is very important. It is only in the eye of the eye. It is only in the eye of the eye that a person is me. Here I'm using the word EYE as a metaphor. I think it is obvious. I put it in inverted commas, that a person will not be a me unless that person is viewed by the eye, unless that person comes under the eye of the eye, under the EYE, metaphorically speaking, of the eye. I think it should be obvious to anyone. I cannot be a me to anybody else than this I. And that's true of everybody. That's an exclusive inner relational fact. So the next statement, bereft of the view of I consciousness, there is no me in the field of consciousness. Remove that I consciousness purview or view, you will have removed the me altogether from the field of consciousness. Your field of consciousness will be minus me, as it were. If I consciousness doesn't focus on the person, in my case, of course, on the person, Bijoy Boruah. So, to come back to the very title of the talk, who is looking at me? So now the sense of me is defined, and therefore the sense of the question, who is looking at me, should also be circumscribed. Given the meaning of me as I have defined, who can look at me? Not just who is looking at me, but who can look at me? Well, in fact, no one else, but only I can look at me. Therefore, no one else, but only I am looking at me. That is the plain answer. Everyone else can look only at Bijoy Boruah, not at me. Because the me identity is a subjective reality manifest solely to the I consciousness. Now, in ordinary language, I mean, all the time we say, hey, look, he is looking at me or she is looking at me. I don't like it. In fact, nobody else is looking at me because nobody else can look at me. Only I can look at me. Look, metaphorically speaking. Of course, ordinary language doesn't have to be so very precise. And that kind of precision will simply break the free-flowing character of ordinary language. However, philosophically speaking, there is always this sort of a revision whereby certain metaphysical facts about the self could be well defined in language. To the world in general, a person is a public entity, third personally identified as she, for instance, as Jhansi ki Rani, or as he, for instance, as Bijoy Boruah. Whereas in the first personal view of I consciousness, the person is always a me, always a me, whether it is for Jhansi ki Rani or for Bijoy Boruah. Because everyone has this first personal view of I shouldn't say oneself, of the person that one is. And then it becomes a me. So everybody else, when they are looking at me, in fact, they are looking at Bijoy Boruah, not at me. That is just a little correction. Proposition Q. I'm coming towards the end. Bijoy Boruah appears to me only. Oh, sorry, Bijoy Boruah appears as me only when I become aware of this person. Because only I have a from the inside awareness of me. This qualification of self-awareness, awareness of oneself, in my case, awareness of Bijoy Boruah. This is awareness from the inside, because that vantage point of awareness, that inner vantage point of awareness, that privileged subject position as the subject of awareness is only available to me, to the I consciousness that Bijoy Boruah is or has. That's why only I have a from the inside awareness of me. That is the reason why this self-awareness is awareness of being me. Others, every other person, only have a from the outside awareness of Bijoy Boruah. I mean, all of you, including members of my family, closest members of my family, they only have from the outside awareness of this person, Bijoy Boruah. Hence, only I can look at me. You can only look at Bijoy Boruah, not at me. Proposition R. So the person Bijoy Boruah is a complex phenomenon of consciousness. I'm making a general point that every person, at least every human person, is a complex phenomenon of consciousness. And this complexity is made up of a nexus, a complex nexus of the subject self and the object self. The I-me nexus. If you have agreed to my analysis thus far, then you would hopefully agree to this characterization of what a person is, characterized as the I-me nexus. Now, further question would be, what exactly is the nature of this I-me nexus in the making of the life of the person, Bijoy Boruah in my case? What exactly is the nature of this I-me nexus? I mean, the question arises because the I-me nexus must have a certain kind of character, certain kind of properties, such that this nexus goes into making the very life of the person, Bijoy Boruah, or the very life of any person, any human person. Next, proposition S. Since a person is me only in the eye of that person, being me is metaphysically dependent on I consciousness. This is another rather significant point I'm trying to make, that when I talked about two kinds of being me and being I must make the point that being me is metaphysically dependent on being I or I consciousness, because if you don't have I consciousness or the purview of I consciousness, there is no question of being me arising at all. There is no question of the very genesis of being me. So the metaphysical dependence of me on the I. The me draws all its sustenance from the resourceful agency of the I. I suppose another significant point. Being dependent, the me has to draw all its sustenance from the resourceful agency of the I, because the I is the agent, and a pretty resourceful one. What do I mean by agency of the I and resourceful agency of the I? Well, the I is the agent of thinking, experiencing, acting, imagining, believing, forming attitudes, everything. Everything that the human person becomes is all because of the resourceful agency of the I. Thus, the me emerges. I should make it bold and italicized. The me emerges as a constructed reality, as a product of the agentive exercise of I consciousness. And maybe this is another provocation for me to say that the me is a construction. It is a constructed reality, not an original given reality. It's a product of the agentive exercise of I consciousness. Next, T. It is only when the products of this agentive exercise are appropriated as mine that consciousness solidifies into a me. Now I'm trying to explain this construction of the reality of the me only when the products of this agentive exercise are appropriated as mine. That means the resourceful agency of the I is responsible for all the things that go into the making of the person, thoughts, different kinds of possibilities of experiences, attitudes, actions, transformations. Okay. All that I say I do or I did, they are the products of this agentive exercise. Now, these products are appropriated as mine. We all say, I think this thought is my thought. I appropriate it. Okay? Consider it as mine. So, what I think, what I feel, what I experience, what I do, what I believe, what I imagine, what I expect, what I plan, all that, all these products, they're all appropriated. And appropriation is owning as mine. That is how consciousness That is how consciousness solidifies into a me. A me grows and solidifies its identity, that inner personal identity. An unconscious desire for identification with the thoughts, experiences, feelings, and actions, which are the products of agentive I consciousness, finds its fulfillment in the manifestation of a personal self, owning those products as mine. Okay. This is the story of the genesis of the me self. Okay. The construction. And this mechanism of identification, appropriation, explains that construction. Personal self. The self becomes a personal self precisely because of this appropriation and ownership. You proposition. From then on, I mean, this is a process. From then on, the metaphysically independent I unconsciously surrenders itself to the seductive forces of the me. The I or subject self, okay, let me stop here, and not stop here, but pause a little bit. The metaphysically independent I unconsciously surrenders itself to the seductive forces of me. What do I mean by this? Well, the me has the seductive forces of appropriation because, the me has already come into being given this mechanism of identification, appropriation, etc. It has already come into being, and then this me is nothing else but a kind of machine that attracts everything that the agent I does, attracts it to its own fold, so that it becomes the fold of mindness, ownership, personal ownership. So that's the seductive force of the me. By the very nature of me, it is seducing for appropriation. So maybe the I is, to begin with, independent. Its only task is to deliver, is its agentive exercise for thinking, for different modes and attitudes of action, for actions, etc. But the I begins to somehow, because of the seductive force of the me, the I begins to identify itself with the me. It surrenders its metaphysical independence. The I then becomes one with the me. That original metaphysical distance is, as it were, eroded. So the I-me nexus no longer becomes a nexus, it becomes an identity. The I or subject self, by losing its metaphysical immunity to the irresistible desire for identification and appropriation, tragically sinks into the abysmal depths of the me. And just imagine that the I starts its life in full metaphysical independence, metaphysically immune to any kind of desire for identification and appropriation. But then maybe given human nature, human fragility, the me does grow. It's something like, an organism. Because of its fragile constitution and because of whatever environmental impingement it gets, develops some kind of a cancerous growth or tumor. And similarly, the me grows, and grows cancerously almost, to engulf the whole of the agentive I. And I call this, a tragic sinking into the abysmal depths of the me. That is the actual tragic human condition. The distance between the I and the me imperceptibly narrows down. So much so that the I becomes one with the me, reduced to the me. To reiterate the tragic human condition, I call this the metaphysical suicide of the I. That is all. Thank you very much. I have ended my delivery.
Thank you, sir, for a very stimulating presentation. And I'm sure the audience will have a lot more curiosity. So now the session is open for the discussion. So if you have got question, please raise your hand and I will allow one by one. So I see one hand raised by Dr. Usha Kiran. Dr. Usha Kiran. Okay, so let us go to another hand raise. Shailesh Kumarji. Dr. Shailesh Singh ji. Sir, your mic is off, so kindly turn on your mic.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for reminding
Boruah sir, आप शेयरिंग बंद कर दीजिए.
Are you hearing me? Am I audible, Professor Boruah?
Yes, you are.
Thank you, sir, for a very illuminating lecture. A very subtle ontological illuminating us towards a very subtle and ontological dichotomy between I and me. But I fail to understand. But I fail to understand. Do you make a watertight distinction between I and me as two different ontological reality, or just a modification of I? Me is just a modification of I. This is my first question. Second question is, in the beginning you referred about awareness, self-awareness. Now, so far as Indian philosophy is concerned, we talk of two kinds of awareness. One, awareness simple as I as a reality. I exist. I have a existence. I am existing reality. And secondly, about our true nature. What's the true nature of self? We also use the term self-awareness in the sense of self-realization. When we say that now I have understood, I have the wisdom of the true nature of I, then what is the impact of this true nature of I on me? These are two questions. These are two curiosity from you, sir.
Very well, very well. Delightfully put, because the first one, whether it is a watertight distinction or just a modification of me, as a modification of I. Now, if by watertight distinction between I and me, one were to literally take the existence of I as one existence and the existence of me as another existence, and if both are independent, as is the case in Cartesian dualism, then there could be, as it were, a life of I without the life of me, or a life of me without the life of I. That wouldn't happen if I have claimed that the me is metaphysically dependent on the I. Yeah? And therefore, watertight distinction in the sense of Cartesian-type dualism isn't there if one reality is metaphysically dependent on the other. And about the allied point of yours, whether me is a modification of the I, well, that's a fairly good suggestion. I mean, I'm saying suggestion, even though you are putting it as an interrogation, as a question. I mean, in some sense, yes, the I is liable to undergo modification in some sense, because given human vulnerability, even though the I starts as independent, as an independent agentive source, because of human vulnerability, frailty, desire and all that, it begins to lose that initial immunity to temptation. And what is that temptation? The temptation of appropriation. I do something, that something is my product of my agential exercise. But is it necessary that I have to appropriate that product as mine? But given human nature, human frailty, I do that. I do appropriate. I do become a personal owner. And that is how the me comes into being. So in that sense, one could say me is a modification of the I. I mean, when the I becomes weak, the I begins to identify itself with the me. Now, that allows me to move to the second question, where you had brought in a classical Indian philosophical insight to bear upon this conversation. One, that twofold distinction, I as a reality, I mean, the defining of self-awareness in these two senses, one being I as a reality, which of course is self-awareness in a descriptive sense. That is to say, recognizing the reality of the I. Then the second sense, the true nature of the self. That is normative analysis, normative spelling out of the notion of self-awareness. What is the good self, as it were, the true self, the self that is free from falsity, the self that enables wisdom? Okay. Now, what bearing does this classical Indian distinction have on what I'm saying? I suppose when I talk about being I as distinct from being me, then I'm talking about the descriptive sense of self-awareness. But then I did not deal with that crucial question. I can be aware of me, that is me awareness, self-awareness as me awareness. Right at the beginning in red ink, I had raised this question. Can I similarly be aware of being I, parallel to my ability to be aware of being me? That question I did not pursue. Okay. But your point raises that question. Can I be, I mean, in the first descriptive sense of self-awareness, can I be aware of I as a reality? Of course, I can be aware of me as a reality. But what would it mean? Not only that I can be aware of being me, I can be aware of being I as well. If I try to be aware of being I, then I have created a second I to make the first I an object of awareness. The first I would become a me then. Now I say, well, I'll continue now. I'll make the second I, I would like to capture the second I in my self-awareness. Then the second I would become a me. And I will have to create a third I. So this will go on infinitely. And in some sense, I awareness probably is impossible. Okay? There may be some other sense that I have not explored in which I awareness as distinct from me awareness is a possibility that I have not pursued. That is a very tough enterprise. Okay. Now to come to this other point, and I'll finish now, I'm taking too much time. The true nature of self, I mean, self-awareness in the normative sense. I suppose, yes, even in my little presentation, when I say the metaphysical suicide of the I, it is not merely a descriptive statement, किसी ने suicide कर लिया. Okay? There is also a normative implication. कि ऐसा होना नहीं चाहिए था. Ideally, if I could exist without any tendency or desire for self-appropriation, okay, that would be the existence of, that would be being I without any corresponding being me in this field of consciousness that constitutes me. Is that possible? And I suppose our classical Indian tradition does talk about this kind of a possibility, where the me content is zero. It's all I content. And ultimately, of course, even that I content disappears. But that is a very Advaitic story I don't want to go into. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shailesh sir, for asking. So let us have another query from someone named Philosophy Technology. Can you hear me with the name
Yes,
Philosophy Technology? Yes, yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please introduce. Your name is something
Sir,
mysterious.
I'm Dr. Madhu M, teaching philosophy at MM College, Jammu. Sir, it is a very resourceful lecture. The question is that regarding in my mind have some statements. The Descartes statement, I doubt, therefore I am, and Kierkegaard statement, I exist, therefore I am, and Kant's statement, I ought, therefore I can. How we can relate these statements to I-me dichotomy? Is there any knowledge in that so when we can know this I-me dualism?
I'm afraid I did not quite understand the question. Did you say, I doubt, therefore I am? I exist, therefore I am? Did you also say that?
So I'm saying that if we have relation between I to me,
Yes.
yeah, so how can we know I and me through I? Because some say that language or thought or doubting or existence, these are the criteria to know me. Now the question is that if I is unconscious of I consciousness, if I is unconscious of I consciousness, then what would happen to me?
Oh. I don't think I said I is unconscious of I consciousness. What I did say is that this I consciousness unconsciously or maybe subconsciously or develops the tendency to identify with the me, to become a kind of a victim of the desire for appropriation. Now that happens. I'm talking about human nature. Okay. When someone is a just born baby, okay, what kind of I consciousness that just born baby has? Does the baby have a sense of being me? Probably there is a rudimentary sense of being me, completely rudimentary, because after all, there is somatic sensation. Okay? The body feels a certain way. So it's me who has that feeling. So in some rudimentary form, the baby has that. And the baby definitely has I consciousness because the baby is a subject of experience, subject of consciousness. It only takes a subject of consciousness to be an I in this fundamental sense. Now, what happens as the baby grows, becomes older and older, the me grows into being. So the ontology, there's a kind of ontological growth in the field of consciousness of the baby. A me grows. And this growth of the me is mostly, it is mostly unconscious, because what the I does is immediately unconsciously appropriated. The sense of a personal self begins to grow. And your question, whether the I is really aware of this me, aware of the genesis of this me, I would say, yeah, mostly the I is not aware of the genesis of the me. Okay? When the I begins to reflect on itself, then of course, it begins to recognize the me. And sometimes that is when self-modification starts. So basically, this is how I am trying to present this idea.
Thank you, sir. I got it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhu. We have some 5 more minutes, so if anyone wants to ask questions. Yeah, Dr. Sanjay, welcome. Yeah, please.
Namaste, sir.
Namaste, Namaste ji.
First of all, I would like to thank you, sir, for your excellent lecture. Just a query, sir. Do you think that self and I both are same or different? In your opinion, what do you think? That self is another thing or identity, or and I is another identity? What do you think, sir?
Well, I mean, if you go by ordinary language, then self and I are the same.
प्लान निकाल ना प्लान निकाल
हाँ प्लान निकाला इसी में ही तो आते हैं
हाँ बता अभी
अब आपने क्या 140
I is the linguistic expression for the self. Okay, so in that sense, there is some kind of identity. I here try to unpack the notion of the self by some kind of philosophical analysis, metaphysical analysis. And this analysis has resulted, according to me, in a kind of inner division or dichotomy, that there is a subject self and there is an object self. The subject self is I, the object self is me. Yeah. Now, in ordinary language, if you go by grammar, what's the difference between I and me? I mean, ordinarily, we would use it interchangeably, okay? I am me, me is I, which is very true, because after all, the self can only be single, just one, not two. But analysis seems to reveal, maybe from a perspectival point, there is an internal division. There is a subject self and there is an object self. The object self is me, the subject self is I. In that case, it would be more appropriate to understand the I as the subject of awareness. And the subject of awareness will never become an object of awareness. Okay.
Okay.
So I will never become me. Me will never become I.
Aye.
And that is a distinction. Okay, one more point about grammar. In grammar, the distinction between I and me is that of a nominative and a dative first person singular. Okay? I is the nominative case, me is the dative case. Now, this nominative dative case distinction is a distinction of formal syntax, all right? But we philosophers can go beneath this grammatical formal distinction. And when we go beneath, we see a huge metaphysical sea, as it were, metaphysical ocean in which such distinctions, such matters, fairly crucial matters begin to emerge. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for asking the question. Now we have the last question, since we have a class from 4:30, so we will have one more question from Dr. Shivani. Madam?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anil Ji. And congratulations, Professor Boruah. It was a very interesting and illuminating lecture. Your discussion while you were discussing with Professor Tewari Ji, one point just came to my mind, that who is the final I or me who realizes this, the unified knowledge, the Advait Gyan. Who is the experiencer of that knowledge? Is it the I or is it the me? Who finally unfolds, who gets unfolded it into this knowledge, final knowledge? That is just a query.
I try to stay away from classical Indian metaphysics not because there is something wrong about it, but because of the distance that I have, distance in knowledge. So the question of finality in terms of Advaita Jnana, I have not allowed to, allowed that question to appear in front of me, because it's too abstract for me that there is something called Advaita Jnana. I can't quite digest this extremely abstract idea of Jnana. My knowledge of Jnana is more limited, less than Advaita. Yes.
Let me try to reframe my question. Who is the experiencer of, because you are assuming that there is an objective self, that is the me self, and there is the knower self, that is the I self. So certainly if there is a duality, we can logically presume non-duality also. But who is the one who is finally going to realize the duality and will, overcome this duality?
Oh, okay. That I think is a very good question and a very good articulation of your earlier one. That means, if you say who is going to realize ultimately this duality, that there is a duality, then I think the possibility of this realization is with the I self itself, with the I self. That is to say, the me self is only a product, it's a construction. And there is a process of deconstruction. Buddhism is a beautiful story, I think, to bring back classical Indian philosophy of the deconstruction of the self. Okay, I am not really playing the language of Buddhism, or I'm not paraphrasing Buddhism, but what I'm trying to say is that if you understand that there is this inner purview, what I call the inner purview of I consciousness, under which a person comes or captured. At the moment it is captured, the me appears to this I. Okay. Now, the I can also understand, of course, upon reflection, how the I is seduced into the me, how the I forgets that fundamental dichotomy and begins to identify with the me, sinks into me. Okay? That realization is the process of deconstruction. Towards the end, I raised this more as a question. Can there be a mode of being, which is the mode of being I, minus the mode of being me, or a field of consciousness, a mode of conscious existence in which the entire content is being I, and there is zero being me content. Being me content becomes zero. Can that mode of existence be realized? And I would say yes, it's possible. It's extremely hard, but it's possible that you make the me content zero. And that would be, I think, self-realization.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Shivani ma'am and Professor. So do you have any more questions? So I guess so Dr. Tewari is leaving for his class, so he handed over the session to me for the vote of thanks. And if there are no further questions, we can stop here for today. And first of all, on behalf of School of Philosophy and Culture, I'm Madhu Chaturvedi. Assistant Professor of Philosophy. So I would like to thank Professor Boruah for his very, I would say, what the hallmark of his is crystal clarity. So the delivery with that crystal clarity is always there. So for his very clear talk and the presentation of his ideas. And this is ICPR Study Circle sponsored by ICPR New Delhi. So we thank the funding agency for their generous grant and all those who could make it to the meeting and make it very successful. So I thank all of those. Some of them have left as well on behalf of School of Philosophy and Culture. And with these words, I would like to wind up today's program and stop here. Thank you, Professor Boruah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Yes, thank you. And participation.